Hello, good afternoon, wherever you're joining us from for the third Global Risk Outlook for Q2 2025. Thank you to all those that are coming back for the third time. I noticed there are a couple, so thank you for that. This is an ever-growing webinar, so welcome to those that are joining for the first time. It's an extremely busy period at the moment, so I'd really like to thank the team that we have on the webinar today and all the preparation that's gone into it. The aim of this is very much to be driven by you, by clients, by customers, and those that wish to join for further intelligence briefings. And the topics are very much driven by you, your concerns around what's happening in the geopolitical space for 2025. So without further ado, I'll introduce the team, headed up by Mark Overington, our Head of Intelligence, and with Joshua George, Julian Kett, and Manfredi Pozzoli as part of the team. Gentlemen, thank you very much for your time. I know it's been an extremely busy period over the first almost 2 quarters of 2025, so your attendance is very much appreciated. On the agenda today, a list of topics that were dictated and suggested by our client base. Hostage diplomacy, the new foremost international hostage-taking concern for Western governments, will be taken by Julian. Security implications of Trump's Mexico strategy will be taken by Mark. Our risk of regional escalation in Africa's Great Lakes region by Josh. And last but very much not least, Bangladesh faces growing instability will be taken up by Manfredi. Julian, if I can ask you to come to the stage and talk about hostage diplomacy, starting with the general question of what do we mean by hostage diplomacy in the first place?
Hi, Rob. The most broad definition of hostage diplomacy would be a state leveraging detained foreign and dual nationals to coerce concessions from another state. In the 1970s, the predominant hostage-taking threat was posed by non-state groups, such as terrorist groups, etc. But since then, and particularly in the last decade, hostage diplomacy has replaced it as the foremost international hostage-taking concern for Western governments. Recently, there was a case that got a lot of news coverage in the UK in February, where a British couple were detained in Iran. Hostage diplomacy happens and manifests in multiple different ways. The most straightforward cases involve arbitrary detention, where someone is detained without any internationally recognized and justifiable basis, and then they're used as a tool for state leverage. However, there are a lot of cases which are a bit more murky than that. Someone is detained on legally justifiable grounds, but then because they're a dual national or foreign national, they're nonetheless leveraged, their detention is prolonged, etc. Ultimately, hostage diplomacy is a state leveraging foreign or dual nationals that are detained to coerce concessions from another state, whether they were initially detained arbitrarily or otherwise.
Thanks, and I know you've created this map for reference as well. I know we've been unfortunately involved in some situations this year. Can you give us an example of some of the hotspots that people should be concerned with?
Absolutely. The predominant perpetrator of hostage diplomacy are authoritarian states, though it's not uniquely conducted by authoritarian states. I'll just go through a few hotspots and key examples. Firstly, Iran, as I previously mentioned, they are likely the world's paramount perpetrator of hostage diplomacy. They've done the practice for decades. Likely, this started opportunistically. Iran is, of course, a theocratic and a deeply oppressive authoritarian regime. And as part of that general political suppression, dual nationals that were detained as political prisoners then transpired to be highly useful when conducting diplomacy in lieu of other methods because they're so diplomatically isolated. Since then, and particularly in the course of the last 10 years or so, this has likely developed into a state strategy. The most high-profile example was the British Iranian dual national Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe, who was detained in 2016. She was ultimately detained for 6 years, only being released once the British government agreed to settle a £400 million debt that dated back to the 70s, which shows the kinds of massive concessions that states, particularly rogue states, can achieve by doing hostage diplomacy. Another major perpetrator of hostage diplomacy is Russia, of course. They've also used arbitrary detention followed by accusations of espionage. Another key MO for Russian hostage diplomacy is arresting people for minor offences, particularly possession of cannabis, and then leveraging them for hostage diplomacy. In 2022, the US professional basketball player Brittany Griner was arrested for this very reason, and she was ultimately exchanged for Victor Bout, an arms dealer who's nicknamed the Merchant of Death. As Russia is so prolifically engaged in hybrid operations across the world, hostage diplomacy effectively provides them with a means of assuring their covert assets globally of a potential negotiated release if they're compromised. And lastly, I wanted to talk about Turkey, because Turkey is a NATO member and a purported ally of the West, but under Erdogan, they have at various moments also conducted hostage diplomacy. The main trigger for this was particularly the failed coup in 2016, following which there was a nationwide state of emergency. Over 30 Western nationals were imprisoned during this period. In a high-profile case, US citizen and evangelical pastor Andrew Brunson, who had been living in Turkey for over 20 years, was detained by authorities, and Erdogan explicitly leveraged his detention to try and get Fethullah Gulen, the exiled pastor who's accused coup leader in the USA. Erdogan, and I quote, said they wanted a pastor for a pastor in exchange. At the time, the first Trump administration did eventually effectively coerce Turkey to release Brunson with the threats and imposition of tariffs and sanctions. In addition to these cases, China has been accused of conducting hostage diplomacy, Venezuela, Afghanistan, North Korea, Burkina Faso, and other countries that are allied with the West, such as even Japan and the United Arab Emirates. They've also been accused of it.
And just putting myself into the shoes of sort of the CSOs and the security managers, what trends can we be identified to help managers either make decisions or make predictions and adjust their internal approach to these sort of areas?
From the perspective of risk management, firstly, there are triggers that increase the risk of hostage diplomacy being used. These can be broadly categorized as being either domestic events, which entail crackdowns, particularly such as in Turkey, the failed coup attempt, or big protest movements, as we're currently seeing in Turkey. Another key trigger is a sudden deterioration in foreign relations that we recently saw in December 2024, an Argentine gendarme arbitrarily detained in Venezuela, and this was likely due to the deterioration in relations between Milei and Maduro. Secondly, some travelers and business travelers and expatriates, etc., are at a higher risk profile of being targeted for hostage diplomacy, though the threat can target anyone. Particularly dual nationals, the risk is considerably higher. Dual nationality is often not recognized. The hostage convention by the UN is arguably non-applicable. And also, dual nationals often have a higher risk tolerance than is justified. Secondly, people with specific occupations, including our own Rob, as well as journalists, academics, people with military or civil service backgrounds, and security professionals like ourselves. Perpetrator states can target anyone, but they're more likely to target people that they can easily accuse of espionage. And thirdly, I think is a key point that we're likely to see develop further in the future, nationals from middle powers that are allied with the US, but don't have the same power as the US, such as Canada, Italy, Sweden. They do not have the same capability to conduct retaliatory measures, but they can be still caught between great power competition and have their citizens therefore targeted. And thirdly, I think security managers can understand the different threats of detention, the different types of detention that are used in hostage diplomacy. Firstly, is arbitrary detention. This is the most difficult threat to mitigate against, though triggers can still be monitored for increased risk. Secondly, there's minor infractions, as I mentioned with Russia, which I think exemplifies the importance of understanding how laws operate differently in different countries, so you won't be exploited for hostage diplomacy. Thirdly, there's this opportunistic political suppression that I spoke about before, particularly in authoritarian states. Anyone perceived to be or actually engaging in any kind of political activism is more likely to be targeted for hostage diplomacy.
Thanks, Julian. It really brings up a different angle in terms of whether people are actually collecting information at all, and that brings into the whole insider threat piece as well, potentially. How can hostage diplomacy be tackled, I suppose, is my last question before we move on.
Well, the reason why it's become such a predominant threat is because because it is such a significant challenge for Western governments to tackle. And that's why the phenomenon has increased, because fundamentally it works. Governments in liberal democracies, they're susceptible to the pressures of democracy. So political parties, because they want to win the next election, don't want to be accused of abandoning their citizens. So the kind of two types of deterrence that liberal democracies can do against hostage diplomacy are generally categorized as either deterrence by denial or deterrence by punishment. Deterrence by denial effectively is the same mantra as no negotiation with terrorists. So in this case, another state. That's a complete refusal to negotiate, which is intended to disincentivize the phenomenon from happening again in the future. The weakness of this, of course, is that doing so prolongs the detention of the already detained. And of course, as I said, the political backlash that they might suffer in elections because of this. The second one is deterrence by punishment. This is what the US effectively did against Turkey, which is to impose punitive measures to compel the release of their citizens. This can be sanctions, tariffs, even the threat of military force, or even retaliatory detentions of the citizens of the perpetrator state. The weaknesses of this is less attainable for middle powers. They don't have the same resources to conduct this. And of course, there's the risks of escalation.
I think we released a full assessment report last Friday, if I'm not mistaken, on this topic that is available for people to download. Mark, if I can invite you to the stage for security implications of Trump's Mexico strategy, please.
We've got a lot of interest in what the security situation may look in Mexico in the impending future, largely as a result of the Trump administration's policy and strategy towards Mexico. So, of course, Trump has made it clear that he wants to deter illegal migration across the US-Mexican border, but most importantly, stem the flow of narcotics, particularly fentanyl, into the United States. I guess the bottom line up front is that as a result of direct and indirect pressure exerted on the Mexican government by the Trump administration, we assess that there will be a gradual deterioration in the security environment in Mexico. Now, the main avenue for coercive action from the Trump administration so far that's taken center stage in the media has been the threat to impose tariffs on the Mexican government. And the Mexican government has already reacted to this quite strongly, almost immediately, to at least circumvent the first wave of tariffs, deployed about 10,000 members of the National Guards to the Mexico-US border. But what I'm going to unpick here is some of the stuff that is more military and security angle and how that could result in that, like I said previously, assessed deterioration in the security environment. Almost immediately after assuming office, Trump designated 6 Mexican cartels, including the Sinaloa and the Jalisco New Generation cartel, as foreign terrorist organizations. Now, our initial assessment of this was that this might not actually achieve too much and was almost saber rattling as a result of there being a lot of counter cartel permissions already extant under counter narcotic frameworks. But it has escalated, and this is widely underreported. Now, you would have noticed that Trump has repeatedly threatened to deploy US special forces or to conduct limited drone strikes against the cartels. Now, these avenues of direct action, the threshold has now essentially been massively lowered as a part of that foreign terrorist organization. But something that hasn't gained as much attention is the use of US military and intelligence assets and personnel that have now been redirected to counter the cartels as a result of that FTO designation. Around mid-February, we started seeing the deployment of strategic level US military intelligence, surveillance and reconnaissance assets fly ISR missions over Mexico, reportedly with the permissions of the Mexican government. Strategic level assets you'd normally only use in sort of the military space, such as P-8 Poseidon maritime surveillance crafts, which could monitor cartel activity on the maritime flank. Rivet Joint, a tier 1 dedicated signals intelligence platform, which I've only really ever seen used before in places like over Ukraine, the Black Sea, or in Afghanistan and Iraq. U-2 high altitude aircraft, which predominantly produce high resolution imagery. And there's also been several hundred, I think by now, military intelligence personnel dedicated towards analysis of that intelligence, but also translation being deployed as part of those anti-cartel operations. Now, this is also combined with CIA activity, who've been flying MQ-9 Reaper drones, not weaponized, only in a surveillance capacity, as well with Mexican authorization. But the CIA is also exploring legal frameworks for targeted drone strikes. And of course, it being the CIA, almost certainly this is being complemented with covert action on the ground, as is often the case. So the question to ask really is, why is this intelligence, what are these assets doing, what intelligence are they collecting, and how could this be used? The production of high resolution imagery and signals intelligence or SIGINT collection is largely going to be used to identify known cartel locations such as fentanyl labs, routes, but it's that SIGINT collection, and that's a key capability, especially in the form that's been deployed by the United States, that the Mexican government, military intelligence agencies simply do not have to the same degree. And it's that SIGINT capability which is going to monitor transmissions on the electromagnetic spectrum, such as radio or phone communications or radar emissions, and intercept these, identify them, and then analyze them. The analysis, which largely be done by the intelligence agency and those deployed military intelligence analysts, will be used to identify known locations, identify trafficking routes, but also map cartel networks and patterns of life, identify leadership, cartel enablers, financial flows, and a whole host of other intelligence work, which could really be used in two ways: in support of Mexican efforts on the ground via intelligence sharing agreements, or they could, in theory, be used to enable the future targeting of the cartels as a result of US direct action, although we currently assess that's the last resort and is being mooted by the Trump administration to coerce the Mexican government into acquiescing to its demands. I guess the next thing to unpick is, how has the Mexican government responded? Now, President Sheinbaum has been quite delicate here. She's completely rejected any breach of US sovereignty, such as US strikes or military deployments in Mexico. But Mexico has definitely ramped up its anti-cartel operations as a result of this. In February, we saw record levels of extraditions to the US, including some key cartel players who have been wanted by the US for decades. Almost half of whom could now face the death penalty as well. There's also been record amounts of seizures and arrests. To give some sort of context there, under President Sheinbaum's first 100 days, she has, compared to her predecessor's first 100 days, President Obrador, conducted 100 times more arms seizures and 2,000 times more drug seizures. The only thing we can take away from here is US direct and indirect pressure on Mexico is having an effect on the ground and is having an effect on the cartels. How have the cartels adapted to this, and how will they likely respond to this? There was some great reporting done by the New York Times recently with the Sinaloa cartel, suggesting that for once they genuinely fear death or arrest. They're starting to relocate production of fentanyl, shut down some operations, invest in anti-drone technologies and other counter-surveillance capabilities, and even import more arms from the US in preparation for a conflict, and have sworn that they will not go down as easily as some are assessing. Income from drugs and human smuggling is down, but they have demonstrated their resilience and, as previously mentioned, sworn to retaliate. Potentially, they're in the space at the moment where they're exercising strategic patience, but I don't think that will last forever. And there's a high risk of escalation. As always, these are often grounded in historical precedents and previous trends. If we look back to around this 2006-2012 era, under President Felipe Calderon, he initiated a war on drugs, which was really aimed at capturing or killing senior cartel leadership. Unfortunately, this resulted in the fragmentation of splintering of cartels, huge internal feuding, and widespread civilian casualties. By some estimates, there were 60,000 deaths attributed to conflicts between cartels and other parties, i.e. security services or other cartels. Some estimates suggest that within this wider era of 2006 to 2020, as a legacy of that policy, maybe as many as 350 to 400,000 were killed in Mexico indirectly or directly as a result of organized crime. More recently, in July 2024, the incumbent leadership of the Sinaloa cartel, El Mayo, was arrested pre-Trump, and data produced by ACLED has demonstrated that already there's been a 2.5-3 times increase in violence in Sinaloa as a result of factionalization that's happened as a result of internal feuding by essentially decapitating the Sinaloa cartel's leadership. Unfortunately, our assessment here is relatively pessimistic. I think the most likely course of action is there will be sustained US pressure and continued intelligence sharing, which will enable Mexican security services, military, police, etc., operations on the ground, which carries a huge risk of cartel infighting and territorial and attempts to fill in power vacuums and expand their territory as a result of perceived weaknesses within other cartels. But there's also been, as evidenced by the recent Sinaloa example, a shift from cartel conflicts from rural zones into urban zones. Much as this has been attributed to the previous senior leadership, at least abiding by some of the rules, traditional rules within cartel culture, it's sort of been pushed aside by younger players with a higher threshold for brazen attack, shall we say. And of course, this has led to increased security services deployments and increased interactions between those and the cartels. So that's the most likely course of action, to borrow military parlance. Most dangerous course of action is if Mexico fails to carry on with its efforts, or these are deemed to not be sufficient by the current US administration. There is the risk of those unilateral drone strikes or short-term US Special Forces deployments. That carries with it practically all of the aforementioned risks attached to the most likely course of action, but could almost certainly be perceived as a breach of US sovereignty, which could undermine Mexico and US intelligence sharing, which would ultimately harm Mexican counter-cartel operations. But the worst case scenario, if the cartels are backed up to an extent and they deem that the US government is responsible for this, there's a realistic possibility we could see an evolution of cartel violence into actual narco-terrorism, whereby they try and influence the actions of an actual state, i.e. the United States, by targeting US interests, personnel, or assets within Mexico or beyond. The cartels have a lot of reach and influence in the United States itself, but also in many other third parties, such as Peru and Ecuador. That's what we're seeing on the ground play out at the moment, and that segues into our assessment as to how this might evolve in the next few months to years.
And Mark, you sort of hit it a couple of minutes ago by saying, in terms of the impact of people that are either on the ground, have assets on the ground, or people on the ground in some way, whether that's traveller or workforce, it's a likelihood of risk increase to those people because of the people migrating or the violence increasing in urban areas potentially as well, getting caught up in the crossfire of gang warfare. Could you just give that a little bit of context of what those risks are to people that might have people in those locations?
It's a very hard risk to predict because it depends on what leadership is taken out, how cartels fragment, and which cartels try to exploit that. But we are seeing in Sinaloa example a trend of violence moving into urban areas. Whenever we put clients into Mexico, we would recommend armored vehicles, armed CPOs. It's getting to the point where we would recommend the strictest security protocols necessary when transiting or traveling to Mexico.
You've got here around the June judicial elections as a potential flashpoint for people to be aware of. I suppose there'll be a gradual build up to that point.
For context, Mexico will be holding its judicial elections on the 2nd of June. Now, this is a sea change in how this is conducted. Previously, Mexican judges and magistrates were chosen by other people in the field behind closed doors. Now, very controversially, the leaving president signed a bill whereby Supreme Court judges right down to the local magistrates will now be elected by popular vote. There's been about 35,000 candidates since last check that have nominated themselves. Now, the danger here is they're going to have to campaign. They're going to have to canvass for votes. They're going to have to expose themselves and their strategies early on and make themselves vulnerable to the cartels, many of whom are going to be antithetical to the cartels' objectives. If we take last year's general elections, which were defined by political violence and assassinations entering May and the canvassing season right up to the 2nd of June, we're going to see a lot of cartel violence directed towards these potential magistrates, judges, etc. Almost certainly entering a very dangerous stage within Mexico.
Thanks, Mark. Aspects of this covered in our election guide, which is available for download.
Normally we cover general elections, presidential elections. This is quite an obscure one, but given the threat associated with it, that's our job, to pull out the threat associated with elections. We had to include it. So there's a bit of analysis there. It might go out again as a standalone product with a bit more fidelity.
Thanks, Mark. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Moving on to risk of regional escalation in Africa's Great Lakes region. Josh, if you could give us a brief overview, please, of the main regional actors and recent events.
The Great Lakes region of Africa pretty much comprises the map on the screen: DRC, Uganda, Rwanda, and Burundi, all of which have stakes in the ongoing conflict. There are numerous actors in the region, the principal one being M23. As you can see on the screen, that is the currently held M23 territory. They obviously captured Goma at the end of January, and then Bukavu the 16th of February. These are the two capitals of North Kivu and South Kivu, respectively. Since then, they've linked up their territories and they've been expanding along the northern and southern, as well as to the western axes, primarily towards Butembo in the north and Uvira to the south. Now, they're not the only militant group in the region. They are the most prominent because they have the backing of Rwanda and are fairly well armed. Other groups include the ADF in the Ituri province and North Kivu province. They aligned themselves with the Islamic State in 2019. It has forced Uganda to have a significant military presence in Ituri and North Kivu to prevent ADF from impacting Ugandan territory. There's also the Wazalendo militias, which are aligned with governments, and other groups such as the Codeco and the FDLR, who all have certain stakes in different territories. Significantly, we've seen big regional players withdraw recently on the side of the government. One of them is the Southern African Development Community, SADC. They are currently in the process of withdrawing. They were on the side of the FARDC, the Congolese military. Also, the UN peacekeeping mission, MONUSCO, is in the process of withdrawing. Burundi, who did have troops in South Kivu to prevent M23's advance, have withdrawn their troops. It's suspected that they've done a deal with M23 whereby M23 stopped their advance towards Uvira. However, as we've seen with a lot of the peace talks and agreements over the past few years, M23 often break these or completely ignore them.
In terms of regional destabilization, obviously very easy for us to look at a map with defined borders, but actually the reality is a lot more fluid, with people movement, intensified competition for resource, etc. around that. Can you give us a deeper outline around the regional destabilization?
There's three main ones that I've identified. The first one is that there's been a vacuum of FARDC forces. These are the Congolese forces that are currently in combat with M23. This has enabled groups such as the Islamic State-aligned ADF to intensify their attacks and entrench their control of certain regions of Ituri. Since the start of 2025, when M23 started capturing more territory, they've significantly increased their attacks in both the number of them as well as the number of casualties. They often target rural communities, Christian communities. A particularly brutal attack was the beheading of approximately 70 Christians in a church around the Beni region. It's also led to the rise of new militant groups. Just last month, the militant group Convention for the Popular Revolution was formed by Thomas Lubanga. This is somebody who's served under Tshisekedi, but he was committed for employing child soldiers by the ICC. He's now out of prison, and he's formed a pro-Hema group. Regarding the Ituri conflict, it's largely between the Hema and the Lendu, the Lendu being Codeco mainly, and Hema have historically been backed by Uganda. The formation of the new group significantly risks intensifying the Ituri conflict. The second destabilizing factor is the refugee crisis. Particularly want to focus on Burundi here, which has had one of the largest refugee influxes in decades, approximately 70,000 refugees since the start of 2025. It's already one of the most densely populated countries in Africa. The communities are heavily reliant on subsistence farming. And so a lot of the population is being threatened by a lack of access to land. And there's been cuts to food rations, as well as soaring food costs and housing prices. Now, notably, there is an election coming up in Burundi, also covered in our election guide. That will be in June this year. It will be unlikely to be a free and fair election. What we may see is significant civil unrest as a result of the soaring prices. The final destabilizing factor is the significant resource exploitation in the region, which has strengthened a lot of the group. M23 primarily aim for the main economic hubs of the regions, which has large mining communities which have been forced to flee. These are backed by Rwanda and Uganda. For example, Uganda's biggest export is gold. It makes up approximately 48% of its total exports, or at least that was a 2022 figure. And the percentage of gold taken from DRC as between 75 and 98% of Uganda's gold essentially has been mined from the DRC or has been taken from M23. This also comprises approximately 31% of Rwanda's exports. So this is somewhat self-fulfilling. As M23 gain more territory and more access to mines, they displace more communities, and they have a source of supplies and money where they can continue to expand their operations and receive the backing from Rwanda and tentatively Uganda.
Thanks, Josh. You've kindly put in some potential escalation triggers in here. Are there one or two that you'd like to bring out? Are there areas where broadly or generically you'd like to bring out a couple of those escalation triggers that people should watch out for?
There are currently ongoing peace talks directly with M23 for the first time in a long while, but the first one would be the continued expansion of M23. If they capture more strategic towns, the main one being Uvira, then we could see Burundi in particular trying to increase its security presence in the region and forced to combat M23. Burundi is currently conducting counterinsurgency operations in its northwest against the Red Tabara. So any move from M23 to encroach upon its border would be a significant security threat to the capital. On that note, if M23 capture more territory, then we will see a likely breakdown of peace talks. We're currently in the very early stages of the mediated peace talks, but there's already quite a lot of mistrust between the two sides. It's likely that M23, if they see that they can capture territory, then they likely will. On that note, if there are increased cross-border incidents, then international community will need to expand its security presence in the region. For example, if the ADF in Ituri and North Kivu approach the Ugandan border again, where they have been previously pushed back, then this would threaten Uganda, and they would likely be forced to increase their presence in the region. The final one I'll cover is if there's a major leadership change. Museveni in Uganda, for example, has played it fairly tactfully regarding support for M23. He hasn't openly said that he supports the group, and he's been very on the sidelines of that so as not to threaten its operations in the DRC. However, his son, who is the head of the military and likely the next in line in succession, he has very openly come out in support of M23, and if he gains power, then we could see even more Ugandan open support for M23 and increased troop presence in the region, which the DRC is unlikely to look kindly upon. The final one is if Tshisekedi in the DRC is deposed. Obviously, there was a coup attempt 2 years ago. If he's deposed, then we could see a change in diplomacy efforts. The next leader may not want to talk directly with M23.
Josh, thank you. Moving on to now Bangladesh. Bangladesh facing growing instability. Freddie, can I ask you to just give us a brief introduction, please? I know this was one of our end-of-year reports that did very, very well in terms of readership.
Bangladesh had a revolution in July, August 2024. This was a revolution that started as a protest against the proposed public jobs reform, quota reform, and then evolved into a widespread revolution that resulted in the toppling of the longtime ruler Sheikh Hasina and of her party, the Awami League. And since then, Bangladesh has been ruled by an interim government led by Nobel laureate Mohammed Yunus. Despite the removal, therefore the success of this revolution and the ousting of Hasina, Bangladesh remains extremely unstable now. The reason for this instability is because the removal of Hasina and the Awami League has created a massive security vacuum in the center of Bangladesh that is likely to have repercussions and impacts throughout the rest of 2025 and beyond.
Thanks, Freddie. Any users of our Solace Secure app will see that the region remains high, but have seen increased crime, terrorist and civil unrest activity. I know crime is a factor that's increased dramatically. Anything you wanted to say about that from a practical perspective for travellers?
In the past few months, especially since the beginning of 2025, but really starting immediately after the revolution, there has been a notable increase in crime, banditry, mob violence, including sectarian violence targeting religious and ethnic minorities, and also perceived political adversaries throughout Bangladesh. There are some statistics that say that between February and March 2025, the number of deaths from mob violence have doubled compared to the previous year. So we are seeing growing insecurity. The reason why this is that after Hasina was toppled, the Awami League was basically purged from occupying its positions of power within local institutions. I don't mean just local government, but also the police and even more day-to-day institutions such as public transport administration. These institutions were run basically on a clientelist basis by people affiliated with the Awami League. Therefore, after Hasina was toppled, there was a massive manpower shortage. In some cases, we've seen a 30% drop in police force in some parts of Bangladesh, and that has resulted in growing instability. For example, not only the fact that the police has lost an important part of its manpower has, of course, made crime more difficult to combat, but also the fact that these vacuums have been created at the administrative level has also created opportunities for parties that were previously sidelined to start actually competing and actually fighting in the streets for control over those institutions. This has created a snowball effect of greater and greater insecurity. And of course, there are other possible impacts that we're seeing. One that we haven't seen yet is terrorism, but there are a number of radical Islamist groups in Bangladesh that were suppressed by the previous government and now are trying to make their way back into the mainstream, and that of course creates more avenues for extremist action potentially.
Freddie, thank you. Is there anything else you'd like to finish off on before I move back to whole questions to the panel?
I'll just finish by saying that what will happen in Bangladesh in the next few months will be hugely dependent on factors inside Bangladesh, but also on external factors. For example, Bangladesh plays an important role in global manufacturing supply chains. We still don't know what impacts, if anything, the changing global trade structure will have, for instance, the US tariffs on Bangladesh. But because the Yunus government is in such a precarious position, important global economic shocks might play a role in the stability or lack thereof inside Bangladesh. It will be important to look at both domestic and international factors in the next few months to assess what the future of the country will be.
Thanks, Manfred. I think that's a really important point as well, is using this type of intelligence to inform whether that's remarket entry into certain areas as well, for either from a consumer perspective or from a manufacturing third-party supply chain perspective. Thank you for bringing that out. Julian, is there anything else you would like to just to cover off, either from the questions that were asked or anything that you wanted to bring back out with the couple of minutes remaining?
Yes, Rob, absolutely. Firstly, on Diana's question on how confident are we that the British couple or businessmen arrested were not collecting information on Iran, I think of course, there's no such thing as certainty in intelligence, but with the Foreman couple that were arrested in January and charged in February in Iran, we can be quite confident. We can say they were more likely to be a naive couple, essentially trying to do their dream trip across the world. However, there is a case that they were collecting evidence or information, even unwittingly, but still were exploited for hostage diplomacy. But most high-profile case of China conducting hostage diplomacy with the two Michaels, I believe it was in 2018. One of them did admit afterwards, after being released, that he may have been unwittingly collecting information. However, China still used that detention as hostage diplomacy following the arrest of a Huawei CFO in Canada just 9 days prior to their own arrest. To address Martin's question on FCDO guidance and hostage diplomacy, the FCDO pages do cover it very generally, but not with any great fidelity. However, the House of Commons have commissioned studies on hostage diplomacy and how the British government and legislature can better combat it, particularly after a case, I think it was 2022, Matthew Hedges was detained in the United Arab Emirates. A doctoral researcher, because of a legal case that followed by Matthew against the government. There was a study that went into it, and it makes for very good reading.
Thanks, Julian. And Mark, just coming to you, anything you wanted to finish off on the reports from you and your team that are now linked into the chat that people can access, but anything else you want to just finish off with?
I'll just say that a lot of innocent behaviour when conducting in some of these high-risk areas, such as just taking a video or a picture of a port or an airport, could in theory be deemed as a collecting pattern of life of this, that or the other. You can easily fall into the trap of being perceived to do intelligence collection, but this isn't the sort of information, unfortunately, the FCDO often provides to you, and it's when you need to come to a professional security firm for tailored advice.
Just to say thank you very much to the panel, Mark and team, for all the preparation. It's not an easy task to do this, and delighted to see it's growing in popularity, and I hope you really get benefit out of that, everyone on the call. This is designed for you to help you and your organisation stay safe when you're travelling abroad or operating in medium to high risk locations. So thank you very much for attending all. Thank you, Mark and team, and hopefully we'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.